Hello, friends, and welcome to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, an AuDHD woman with EDS, POTS, complex PTSD, and OCD, shaped by an abusive religious upbringing. I spent much of my life feeling like I was balancing precariously over an endless pit, constantly reaching for a stable home that always seemed just out of reach. Today, I can honestly say that home is wherever I am right now, built on the stable ground that's growing out of a deepening relationship with my body and myself. In this podcast, I share the lived experiences that brought me here, in case it helps someone feel less alone or supports them on their own journey home. This week's episode is a continuation of last week's episode, where I discussed coming to understand that my lifelong workplace conflicts were not just sexism, but the intersection of sexism and anti-autistic bias after recognizing that I was autistic. So essentially understanding my experience of intersectionality in the workplace. And to summarize a little bit more, I also talked about shifting from blaming myself or seeing my struggles as isolated incidents to recognizing them as systemic bias, which clarified why I reacted the way I did and why workplaces often pushed me out. And this pushed me to emotionally detach from workplaces that demand conformity and instead find meaning in spaces where my natural communication style and sense of justice don't have to be suppressed. And I also mentioned some statistics on autistic women, but I forgot to mention that I actually did pull a couple of studies on both allistic and autistic female struggles in the workplace. So I will link those in these show notes because I used them for my little summary of the struggles that women as a whole, as well as autistic women specifically, face. Of course, I also have my lived experience as a woman and an autistic woman, but since I was pulling studies for the other autistic women specifics, I figured I would share these sources as well. I will say that so one of them is a study of sexism in the software industry, so that's, women in general. And one of them is challenges for autistic women in the workplace. And that one I will say does have kind of a small sample size and inconclusive results, and I also can't seem to find access to the full study. But I do promise that what I shared is at least anecdotally true for me and my female autistic friends. Okay, I also did want to expand a little bit on my idea of neurotype as a protected class. I promise that we will get to more details of how to emotionally detach from discriminatory workplaces, but I did want to expand on this idea a little bit further. So, first, instituting neurotype as a protected class would move from a medical disability model to something closer to an identity-based protected class, right? Laws like Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibit discrimination based on characteristics such as sex or religion, regardless of disclosure or diagnosis. If neurotype were treated similarly, a person wouldn't need to formally disclose or prove a diagnosis to claim discrimination, only that they were treated differently based on perceived traits. This core idea, in my opinion, protecting people from discrimination based on perceived cognitive or behavioral traits rather than requiring diagnosis, better aligns with how bias often actually occurs. And the idea would be to protect all individuals from discrimination based on those traits, whether neurodivergent or neurotypical traits. similar to gender protection in Title VII. That's kind of what I'm trying to base it on. And it would focus enforcement on differential treatment tied to those traits, not on proving a diagnosis. And interestingly, this does already have a partial foundation in the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, through the regarded as standard, but it could be strengthened. So the regarded as standard basically says that you can claim discrimination if you can prove that the other person was regarding you as disabled. So it kind of focuses more on their perception. But this could be strengthened by clarifying that observable traits, such as atypical eye contact, communication style, sensory responses, count even without diagnosis, and that plaintiffs don't need to prove that the employer correctly identified a condition, only that treatment was based on perceived difference. And of course, it's not like people are winning ADA suits or even other, like based on Title VII discrimination suits all the time. They absolutely are not. I just think that this is one small way that we could see an improvement. So, in my opinion, my proposal of neurotype as a protected class pushes further than the current doctrine in two ways. It centers perceived behavioral difference rather than medically framed impairment, and it challenges whether workplace standards like teamwork or hierarchy can ever be neutral. If the goal is to reduce bias based on neurotype within existing systems, that is, until we can actually tear down the system itself, a workable direction could be expanding regarded as to explicitly include perceived cognitive behavioral traits, not just impairment framing, and to require employers to justify rules like teamwork or communication style as job related and necessary rather than assumed norms. And I really like this because what the justification of rules idea does is it tightens a concept that already exists in discrimination law, that employers can set standards, but those standards must be connected to the job, not just preference or convention. Ha ha, we all know that's not actually what happens, but theoretically. Under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act and under ADA, courts already use versions of this through two related tests: job related and consistent with business necessity, and the essential functions of a job. So, in my ideal case, these tests would be applied more rigorously to things like teamwork or communication style, which are often vague and culturally biased. So, for instance, the essential job functions wouldn't be must be a team player, but would be must coordinate with three coworkers daily to complete shared tasks within X time frame. It wouldn't be strong communication skills required. It would be must clearly document steps in writing so others can replicate the process. And this shifts from vague norms to measurable functions. Because, as all marginalized and autistic people know, traits often labeled negatively, such as bluntness, reduced eye contact, preference for written communication, often don't actually interfere with job performance. They only conflict with unspoken social expectations. So if we required justification from the employers, it would force them to answer, does this trait actually prevent the work from getting done? If not, rejecting someone for it starts to look like discrimination rather than evaluation, which of course we already know is the case, but the point would be to make the courts see it as the case. Okay, mandatory disclaimer, I am by no means a legal scholar. This is just me ranting about my ideas. If anybody is a legal scholar and would like to give me feedback on this, that would be totally awesome. But this is just based on my opinions and my research as a disabled person. Okay, now on to the actual topic of emotionally detaching from discriminatory workplaces in the midst of surviving capitalism. Detachment for me means observing instead of absorbing. I still notice unfairness, but stopped trying to internalize it or fix myself to fit in, and in some ways, stopped even trying to fix the discriminatory environment around me. I focus on what I can control, my responses, boundaries, and exit plans. I think that there are absolutely times to speak up, like I have spoken up in meetings about our certain policies disproportionately affecting marginalized people, etc. And there are times to only do the bare minimum and preserve energy. I have also begun to devalue career success and kind of put more value into other things like creative and relational success, even just like relational success within myself, like having a good, nurturing relationship with myself. I think that capitalism very much teaches us that work is identity and um, defines our worth, and that is very much not true. I think that that perspective makes, people who struggle to fit in the workplace feel all the more ostracized, understandably so. And I definitely think the answer is for us to not be ostracized anymore. But in the meantime, I do think that devaluing career success a little bit is pretty good. Um, and I also do want to say that emotional detachment works in a lot of areas. For instance, if you have family members that you want to maintain a relationship for various reasons, but you know, they mistreat you in certain ways that make you very angry, or they, I don't know, try to get you to justify your actions and over explain to them, and they're very judgmental or whatever. It is still possible to maintain sort of surface level relationships while emotionally detaching. Things like gray rocking, or just like not giving them details, limiting what you tell them, not allowing the things they say to really affect you internally. Um, and so this is just kind of a very similar extension of that, of applying that to the workplace. And maybe limiting personal details that you share with coworkers or bosses, not really letting your performance review get to you. Understanding that raises are a lot about who you know rather than what you actually do, and you know understanding that that asshole old guy who keeps failing upward, it says more about the patriarchy and the shitty system we live in than it does about you being overlooked and that sort of thing. So, anyway, I think that detachment in this context, at least for me, works best as a set of deliberate habits rather than a single mindset shift. The goal is to reduce how much of you the workplace gets while still meeting your needs. So, I made a list of things that I find helpful um, in emotionally detaching from the workplace. So, start by separating identity from performance. Treat your job as a role you're playing you're playing for pay, not a measure of your worth or authenticity. That mental boundary makes criticism or exclusion easier to interpret as part of the system, not a judgment of you. And then number 2, limit emotional investment in outcomes you don't control. This one I feel like is very key. I'm very prone to just feeling like I need to change the outcome when in a lot of cases I can't control how much discrimination happens. Discriminatory environments often reward conformity inconsistently. So overinvesting just creates frustration, right? Like you might speak up and someone might listen to you one time and maybe they make a small change, but then the next time it just like goes unheard because I don't know, maybe you conformed, but you didn't conform in the right way. Your tone was a little off, whatever. So focusing on clear transactional goals helps, right? Like complete the task, get the money, maintain financial stability. Anything beyond that is optional. Joining an ERG, trying to fight for disability rights at your company, um, all of that is optional. Um, although, okay, I will say, I don't think it's quite optional for the privileged people. Like, I personally believe I am disabled and a woman, but I am white. So I think that if I see an act of racial discrimination in the workplace, I personally believe that it is not optional for me to speak up about that. But I think that, because in that case, that relates to my white privilege. But if I feel like there is a sexist policy or an ableist policy, I feel like then it's kind of optional for me to preserve my energy versus actually engage and fight. But I do think that if a abled person or a man sees that, I I would expect him or her if it's an able-bodied woman, um, or they if it's an able-bodied non-binary person, to step in. But that's a different topic. I just wanted to mention that. Okay, number three, use selective engagement. You don't have to respond to every problematic comment or dynamic. Choose when it's worth your energy and when it's safer to disengage. Think of attention as a limited resource you allocate intentionally, like spoons for disabled people. Number four, create identity anchors unrelated to work. This is kind of what I was talking about with seeing success in other areas of my life. I'm not just an engineer. I'm also a podcaster, right? I'm also a member of the autistic community. I'm also an aspiring content creator. I'm also a Pokemon lover and an avid reader. So many other identities. Make sure there are parts of your life, relationships, interests, communities, whatever, where you don't have to mask or conform. And the stronger those are, the less psychological weight the workplace holds. Right? And just to make this more general, autistic people very much have to mask and conform, but I would say, this is applicable to all people who feel the need. Black people who feel the need to mask and conform to white gaze, women who feel the need to mask and conform to the patriarchal gaze, etc., etc. Okay, what number are we? One, two, three, four, five. Number five, build practical exit leverage, even slowly. This can mean saving a small buffer, developing a skill, or keeping an updated resume. So, for example, I always try to save as much as possible when I have a job because I spend so much time not having a job. Um, and I also try to constantly, not constantly, but like regularly update my resume, write little blurbs about whatever work I'm doing so that I can include it on my resume if I get suddenly fired or let go, which absolutely has happened. I don't think you need an immediate escape plan, but just a sense that you're not permanently stuck, that this job is not the only thing that you'll ever get for the rest of your life. For me, that alone reduces emotional entanglement because I absolutely have been like, I'm just so tired of job searching that this is just going to be my job for life, right? And that definitely puts a lot of pressure on that job to be perfect. So, definitely don't recommend that, especially because that job can very well fire you, or lay you off, or whatever, treat you very badly. It's like the same as a relationship. You should always have an exit strategy to a romantic relationship. I mean, ideally, you would continue wanting to be with that person for the rest of your life or whatever, if that's what you want, but don't put all your eggs into one basket in a relationship either. Okay, sidetrack. Number 6, and the last one. Finally, it helps to accept the trade off without framing it as failure. Detachment can feel like disengagement or numbness or failure, right? But in hostile environments, it's often a form of self protection, not loss. If you feel like, you know, you're just like screaming into a void when you try to fight for your rights and include being included in the workplace and nothing happens, I mean, I think it's a valid strategy to just protect your energy and invest it elsewhere. And that's not a failure. That just says more about the system than it does about you. So, in summary, the way to emotionally detach from a discriminatory workplace is to treat the job as a transaction, keep your identity elsewhere, and invest your energy where it's actually returned. As we come to the end of this episode, I want to thank you for spending this time with me. If anything in this episode resonated with you and you'd like to share a thought, reflection, or bit of feedback, you're very welcome to email me. And if this podcast feels supportive or meaningful to you, I'd appreciate it if you left an honest review or shared it with someone who might also find it helpful. That's how this work finds the people that it's meant for. You've been listening to Home is Where the Body Is. I'm Jen, and I wish you a safe journey home.